Welcome to Volume 4 in the series, South Pender Pioneer Families, with Frank Trice recounting the Conery family story. This series is dedicated to learning about the unique and important history of South Pender Pioneer families and their connection to S DÁYES, South Pender Island, and the surrounding Salish Sea. In the 1970s, Frank came to live on South Pender Island with his uncle Bill Wilson, who had recently married Sybil Conery. He spent his teenage years growing up in a house with Bill and Sybil on a property that Sybil had named Little Splash. Sybil played a very important part in Frank's life, and upon her death in 2014, he dedicated himself to learning about the full history of the Conery family. He will share many rich and interesting stories from the life of Sybil's parents, Claude and Leah, how they met during World War I, and Claude's history on Salt Spring Island, which dates back to the 1890s. He will speak about Sybil's two siblings, Claudia and Fred, and also recount the extraordinary life Sybil led. That, and so much more. This recording was made in February 2024 inside the Church of the Good Shepherd on South Pender Island, and is made possible with grants administered by the South Pender Historical Society. I am your host, Chris Wakaluk, and it is my pleasure to present this series to you. My voice has been extracted from this final audio in order to give maximum time and clarity to the interviewee to communicate and share their stories. Thank you for listening. Now here is Frank Trice sharing the Conery family story.
My name is Frank Trice, and I'm a South Pender Islander from the 1970s in particular. I'm going to tell the story as well as I can of the Conery family of South Pender, but they were also significant community members on North Pender, the members of the Conery family, and on Salt Spring Island before and at the end of the life of the father of the family, who was Claude Conery. So I came into contact with the Conery family in December of 1972, when as a 13-year-old boy, I came to live with my uncle Bill Wilson and his wife Sybil Wilson of South Pender. And they took me in because I needed a home. And so throughout my high school years, so 1973 to 1977, I lived with them much of the time in their house on South Pender on Plumper Sound on the east side of South Pender. The house was called Little Splash, and that had been named by, the property was called that, and that had been named by Sybil when she had first built the original cabin, or had that cabin built on the property in the early to mid-1950s. So when I arrived to live with them, my Uncle Bill was the person who was my guardian, but Sybil soon came to become as important, if not more important, in my life and my adolescence as Bill, as she looked after all the things that needed to be looked after for getting me ready to go to school on Salt Spring Island, where the high school was. There was no high school on, certainly not South Pender, but no school at all on South Pender, but the school on North Pender only went to grade 7, I believe. And I arrived basically in the middle of grade 8. So that I started at Salt Spring Ganges, the school there, in January of 73, and spent much of the 4 years at high school there, 4.5 years boarding during the week, but then very often coming home to South Pender, what had become my home, with Bill and Sybil. So I did not know much at first about Sybil's family, who were the Conerys. So Sybil was born Sybil Conery in 1921 in Victoria, but her family, I learned soon, had a long history on Pender Island, South Pender in particular, but also I found out on Salt Spring Island because I was going to school on Salt Spring and I kept discovering these connections that Sybil would say, oh, I know those people. Or in one case, that person I didn't realize was married to a cousin of hers on Salt Spring. And I was a friend with the daughter of this cousin who was, this cousin of hers. And so I learned soon that the Conery family were a very Gulf Island family, but very particularly important on South Pender, as well as a little bit on North Pender, and certainly originally on Salt Spring. So shortly after I came to live here, actually I think it was Super Bowl Sunday in January 1973, I just started school on Salt Spring when we were off to meet Sybil's mom and dad, who it turns out were living on Salt Spring. And this was Claude Conery and Leah Conery, and they were in their 80s, and they would be, I guess, like my grandparents at that point. I had never known any grandparents, so suddenly, through Sybil, I had these people who were like grandparents. But I didn't have much connection to them. They accepted me totally as Sybil's foster child, and I mainly remember watching the Super Bowl that day. But I met Claude and Leah. They were in their 80s, and I'd learned they had retired to Salt Spring. And about a year or so later, year and a half later, Leah Conery died. She had had dementia, and I think she was about 87 or so when she died. And by then they had moved to Sydney, possibly for health reasons and being close to the care place or hospital or whatever. So I did not know Leah Conery, Sybil's mum, significantly, but I got to know her dad because he carried on for another 8 years till 1982, when he died on Salt Spring at the care place near the hospital there in the summer of 1982. And he was almost 90 at that point, almost exactly 90. So Sybil and Claude were my two touchstones, my two connections to the Conery family. And over the years, I figured out more and more things about the family. And it wasn't until Sybil died in 2014, in her early 90s, that I really did the full research on the family's history. So that is what I'll try to present some stories from. Claude Conery, I'll start with him. He had been born on Salt Spring Island in 1892, and his parents, Socrates Tobias Conery and Sybil Conery, or Sibby, had come from the northeast U.S., around Vermont. They were an Irish-American family, and they had come to Salt Spring. I think they had 2 kids already, and I think Claude was the youngest of them. So they came in the late 1880s with, I think, a son and a daughter. And then Claude was born on Salt Spring in 1892, while his dad and mum were running a dairy farm that they had set up there near Blackburn Lake, what's now Blackburn Lake, in the central part of Salt Spring. But in those days, a small lake, it was called Conery Lake. So that's been forgotten, and it's now known as Blackburn Lake. But I like that there was a Conery Lake, that ST, I think he was called Old Sock, because Socrates Tobias was such a mouthful. So Old Sock Conery and his wife and family had the dairy farm. And one of the significant things there is that the dairy farm was a major contributor of milk to the Salt Spring Island Creamery, which was a significant business that had been started nearby in the central part of Salt Spring. And it was well known for producing butter that was sent all over, the West Coast, basically. So Claude came from a dairy farming family on Salt Spring that were Irish-American originally. So he grew up there, and sadly, by the early 20th century, a couple of disasters befell the family. First, the house burned down, the farmhouse, which would have been a big blow to the family. I don't think they were wealthy, and this was the main house on the farm. And then shortly after that, Claude's mother, Sibby, died on Salt Spring, and that left father, Socrates Tobias, and then oldest son, also S.T. Conery, but he was known as Bud, and Claude as basically young men with their dad. And at that point, around 1909, they the two young men and their dad headed back to the U.S. for a few years. The young men presumably figuring out what they would do with their lives. So that could have been that, except that World War I started in 1914. And amazingly, Bud and younger brother Claude came back from the States to join up with the Canadian Expeditionary Forces and go fight in Europe. Older brother Bud was not much of a soldier at all, and I think he might have got booted out for some disciplinary issues. But Claude, younger brother, was, though he was slight, he wasn't a big man, went to the Western Front in Belgium with his battalion, who were called the Western Scots Battalion, out of Victoria. So it was 1915, they came back. I think by 1916, they were both signed up. By 1917, only Claude, I believe, ends up on the Western Front near Ypres in Belgium. And he's been in battles. And Claude was wounded at the Battle of Passchendaele, which is one of the great battles that the Canadians fought and helped to turn the tide of World War I. So he was wounded by basically shell shock, continual bombardments, and also poison gas. So his breathing was severely affected, and basically he couldn't continue fighting. So Claude ended up hospitalized in England, and by late 1917, which is after the Battle of Passchendaele, and a year or so before the war actually ended. And in England, in hospital, during 1918, he met a young volunteer nurse called Leah McFarlane. And Leah McFarlane was from Belfast. She was actually older than Claude by a few years, now I know. But that ended up becoming an important thing for the family because they fell in love and got married in Belfast in 1918. So Claude is one of those cases of a, young Canadian soldier, like so many others, who gets wounded and then in hospital or somewhere meets a young woman, a British woman, and falls for her and gets married. And then Leah Conery came back to Canada after the war as a war bride. So that's a great connection to Canada's history. And I think Leah McFarland, who was from Belfast, had several brothers and sisters. They were half-brothers and sisters, and she was the oldest of them. So coming to Canada for her, was a significant thing to do because leaving quite a good-sized family behind. They were Presbyterians, and which was common in Northern Ireland. Well, that was part of Great Britain at the time. And Claude was not particularly religious, but would have had vaguely, from his Catholic upbringing, vague connection originally to being Catholic. But that didn't cause any problems in this case because Leah was not staying in Northern Ireland where that might have been an issue, but she was coming to Canada. So Claude returned to Canada in 1919 with all the other soldiers after World War I, and Leah came out, I believe, in early 1920 with many war brides that came back who had married Canadians overseas. So they came to Victoria, and it was in Victoria in 1921 that my Aunt Sybil Conery was born. And now begins the Pender Island part of the story. Sybil Conery was associated with North Pender or South Pender Island for the next 92 years of her life, from 1922 to 2014 when she died. She came to North Pender in 1922 at the age of 1 with her mom Leah and her dad Claude, because Claude had built a little cottage at Roseland on North Pender, which had opened recently as a place where there were cottages, perhaps for holidayers, but also for people who needed a small place. And I believe you could build your cottage yourself, which I think Claude did, But then if you left the cottage behind. So you were basically a renter and probably a 2-room cabin, I would guess. And the family of 3 came to live there. Claude had become a logger as a young man. And so that was his career. Independent logging wasn't very lucrative. Lumber was nowhere near as valuable then as it was now. It's often seen as of something in the way of whatever you wanted to do. But there was lots of big trees on the Gulf Islands. And so he had set up his logging on the Gulf Islands, partially because his older brother, Bud, was a logger. And so they probably logged together part of the time. I know Bud was on North and South Pender for brief periods during the 1920s. But as far as the pioneer aspect of Pender, it was Claude who was the Conery member who, was a latter day settler on Pender. So starting in 1922, they're living at Roseland, but later in 1922, so I think Leah might have arrived pregnant, Sybil's sister Claudia was born. And Claudia was born on Salt Spring Island at the hospital there that had been open just for 6 or 7 years. And it was by then a huge advancement that there was a hospital on the Gulf Islands. And Roseland is located across from Salt Spring. So Claude traveled everywhere by boat to do his logging. So they went by boat to the hospital so Leah could give birth to Claudia there. 2 years later, another child is born, and this was the only son, Fred. So that was 1924. And around that time, either just before or at that point, the place at Roseland would have become too small for a family with 3 children. And Claude, as a veteran, was entitled to a piece of land that was called a soldier settlement property. And the deal with that from the federal government was that you could have a piece of land, possibly 10 acres even, but you had to develop it. And you had to show that you were developing it by clearing it for farming or some use and building a house on it, some kind of dwelling. So there would be an inspector would come around regularly to check that there were these improvements, as they were called, so that you could then get ownership of the land by showing enough improvement. So Claude did this, being a logger and I guess a young man of the 1920s. He'd have been in his 30s by then, after World War I. And even with his being disabled from the army, he was able to build a good life on Pender. They lived on North Pender throughout the 1920s, and the soldier settlement property from about 1924, when Freddie was born, to 1930, when they left North Pender, the soldier settlement property was on Clam Bay Road. So kind of the other side of North Pender from Roseland, the Hope Bay side of the island. So Claude and Leah and the kids were all a significant part of the local community, especially with 3 children going to school at the little school near Hope Bay that's now the New to You thrift store. So that had been built in 1902, so was up and functioning well by the 1920s. I think Freddie may have just started kindergarten there in 1929. He'd have been 5 years old. Claudia had done grade 2, I believe, and Sybil, I think, had completed or was in grade 4 in early 1930, when tragedy befell the Conerys of North Pender because Claudia fell ill in January of 1930. It was tonsillitis, I believe, and unfortunately it got infected and developed into toxemia, which I think is blood poisoning. And she died at the end of January 1930 at the age of 7. So this is Sybil's younger sister, Fred's older sister, but only 7 years old. And it would have been a huge shock to the family. It was late January, and I think when it became clear how ill she was, there had been a plan to take her to Salt Spring to the hospital. It was a very bad storm. And that might not have made any difference, but that wouldn't have helped. So Claudia died in late January 1930 and was buried the next day in the North Pender Cemetery And her grave is still there. So I did not know that when I was younger, but learned that, more recently. So I think that must have been a big shock to the family. They had befriended during the 1920s a man named Herbert Spalding, who was also a logger. And he and Claude Connery must have met logging. I believe they met on Saturna logging, but probably did logging projects together. And I think this was quite important to have this friendship and co-workership, fellowship, because I believe it was Herbert Spalding who may have helped them, the Connery family, relocate to South Pender after Claudia died in 1930. And that would be because the Spaldings were the major family of South Pender. Herbert Spalding was the only son of the family of Arthur and Lilias Spalding. He was in his 20s then, in the 1920s, and so a little bit younger than Claude, but he had served when he was very young, at like 18 years old, 17 or 18, in World War I for the last year of the war. And he was already, I think, an accomplished logger because I think he might have already been involved in forestry type operations when he joined up in World War I. Certainly in World War II, Herbert was a major contributor in the forestry operations that were carried out, necessary operations during Canadian forces efforts in World War II. So Herbert Spalding and his wife Winifred. Herbert and Winifred had married in the mid-20s and were living on South Pender. Herbert was a logger, also had the helping on the farm of his family on South Pender, but I think that's what helped bring the family to South Pender. So the Connery family moved to South Pender into the house at the east end of the valley that was owned by the Tommy and Helen Walker. Helen Walker was Herbert's older sister, and she and Tommy Walker had built a house with the Spalding family and other people's help at the east end of the valley, and that house is still there as you come into the valley from the Boundary Pass Drive side. So the Walkers were away at the time. Tommy Walker, I think, was working in Richmond, and so the house was available. And so Herbert, I believe, helped set this up, or at least, the connection couldn't have hurt, right? So the Connerys came and lived in the Walker house for, I think, close to 2 years till 1932 and got their start in the Spalding Valley. And then in early 1932, both Arthur Spalding, the patriarch of the Spalding family, Herbert's father, and a close friend of his and an old islander called Gerald Richardson both died. They were both farmers. Gerald Richardson had a sheep farm right here by the Church of the Good Shepherd, and going up covering Greenburn Lake and, however many, probably 80 or 100 acres of land that he had cleared and ran sheep on. So he was the major shepherd on South Pender and sheep farmer. And Arthur Spalding had been a general, multi-purpose farmer all through the valley nearby. So they both died in early 1932, and Tommy Walker and Helen Walker were coming back to South Pender. So the Connerys needed a place to stay, and they ended up living in the Richardson house after Gerald Richardson died. He had been a bachelor, and so there was no family other than his sisters in England. And by a stroke of luck, or good chance, whatever, Tommy Walker was Gerald Richardson's executor. And so the executor would be working on plans to do with Gerald Richardson's property in conjunction with his heirs, the sisters in London or in England. And so I believe that's how the Connery family ended up based at the Richardson farm, right beside the Church of the Good Shepherd, the modern Church of the Good Shepherd, from 1932 till after World War II. So for possibly 14 or 15 years. And that's a huge good luck because the school was right beside the Richardson farm. And the kids had already started school here, Sybil probably in grade 5 and 6, Freddie in grade 3, I guess. So the school went till grade 8. and it had only opened in the mid-20s. So their timing, Connery's timing was really good for, having access to what was needed. So Claude Connery, Leah, Sybil, and Fred moved from the valley to the Richardson farm, and through the 30s were going to school here, right by the farm, and would often spend time down at the Bedwell Harbor dock, because it was very close to the Bedwell Harbor dock, near where we are today. So it was a perfect location. Claude Connery could continue logging, but he was also caretaker for the property, while the Richardson sisters in England decided what to do longer term with it. So so many strokes of good luck. And, the friendship with the Spalding family, in particular, Herbert Spalding and his wife, Winifred Spalding, are really key to, I think, the success of the Connery family and, being able to stay on South Pender all those years and things kind of working out well for them here, or for as long as they did, for 14 years at least. Winifred Spalding, Herbert's wife, had, I think, attended Claudia when she was ill on North Pender, because Winifred had trained as a nurse. And she had actually trained in Victoria, Royal Jubilee Hospital, but had also spent a year on Salt Spring at the hospital there, close to when it had first opened. So that's another really interesting connection I found later, is that David Spalding, Winifred and Herbert's son, mentioned that he thought Winifred might have been called out to help with whatever she could as a nurse when Claudia was ill. And so this would have really been another connection to the family, a very strong connection. And Winifred Spalding, Herbert Spalding, her husband, ended up lifelong friends of Sybil Conery Wilson. And I had no clue about this when I first came, because probably the first person I was introduced to by Sybil was Winifred Spalding a few days after I arrived. Winifred was a generation older than Sybil, 25 years older than Sybil, 22 years older. So like a grandmotherly figure to me, but like a mom figure to Sybil, a second mom. So the other connection there is that Winifred was a very strong Anglican, a Church of England churchwoman. And there was no church on South Pender, but she had come from Galliano, from a strongly Anglican family there, married Herbert Spalding, did whatever she could to, have services on South Pender with the visiting minister and houses, people's houses and things, and would have been instrumental in pushing to get a church on South Pender. And although Sybil, I don't think, was Anglican when she was young, she became a devout Anglican, by the time she was, I would say, in her late 20s or early 30s. And the influence of Winifred Spalding there would have been significant in terms of giving an example of leading a life of faith, right? So the Spalding connection, again, hugely important. And then the connection to the Church of the Good Shepherd is that the Connery family were living a couple of 100 yards from the site of the Church of the Good Shepherd before it existed. And after General Richardson had died and the Connerys were living on the Richardson property for a few years, there was an organized effort to build a church on South Pender. In 1937, this began with a meeting of all of the South Pender Islanders who had any interest whatsoever, which was pretty much everybody, to have a community church. And they met down at Bedwell Harbor, which had recently become a resort development in the mid-30s. So Bedwell Harbor had a little resort and a hall down there, a meeting, and decided they were going to build a church one way or another. And where would it be built? So Claude Connery suggested that it could be built on a little piece of the Richardson land if that could be acquired, because he knew the size of the property and it was right beside Bedwell Harbor. So early 1937, this was the big project. And within a year, the church was built. Claude Conery, living right nearby, helped select the site. As soon as they had that first meeting in early 1937, they came up and walked around. And then Claude Conery helped with the survey of the site. And it's only about a half-acre piece. Tommy Walker, the executor of the Richardson estate, was still here at the time, and he probably arranged with the Richardson sisters in England, asked them about donating the piece of land. And so this is where the Church of the Good Shepherd becomes intimately connected to the story of the Conerys, but in particular Sybil Conery. Because when it was built and opened, I would guess her father Claude had helped build it. I would guess her brother Fred had helped build it because it was a community effort, trying to build a community church, which of course became an Anglican church because it needed a priest and it's the organization, but it initially was thought of as a community church for any faith of generally Protestant variation, Christian Protestant variation. And Sybil would have been going to high school by then. She'd have been 16, 17 years old, and the school here just went to, I believe, grade 8. So Sybil did her first part of high school on North Pender, possibly grade 9 and 10, and then finished up in Victoria, grade 11 and 12. So that would be in the late 30s, but she would often visit her family from North Pender, obviously, but also Victoria. And the ferry came in from Victoria to the dock at Bedwell. So it was just an easy walk up the hill to see her parents, see her brother, even though she was at high school and he was still here. Fred did schooling only up till grade 8, I believe. So that would be about 1936 or 7, probably around the time Sybil headed to North Pender to do her beginning of her high school there. So he would have gone till grade 8, and then, like many boys did, would have helped his father with maintaining the Richardson farm, which had sheep and, I believe, some cows. And one had to get the sheep from up at Greenburn Lake, at the end of the summer and bring them down, etc. So I believe Fred wanted to be a farmer and was learning all he could, having grown up here and helping his dad and perhaps doing other jobs. So the church was completed in the spring of 1938 through this big effort from the community, raising money, building it itself, with help from builders from North Pender, because this is a frame church, and most of the people on South Pender traditionally were building log houses, log structures. So the framing, especially the fact it went up, 25 feet and needed a spire, needed a more of an expert. And so a couple of people came from North Pender, especially Fred Smith, who was a North Pender Islander, who had South Pender connections. So with the help of experts and under the management of a South Penderite called Jerry Parkin, who was another World War I veteran and had come to South Pender in the early 20s, minus a leg, as Arthur Pender once famously put it, because he had been severely wounded in World War I and lost a leg, in one of the battles, and had done amazingly well even with that, and came to South Pender and started a family in the 1920s. So Jerry Parkin was a can-do guy, and he was friends and another lifelong friend of Sybil Conery's, who would have known the family from when she was 10 years old. So I learned about so many of these connections later, after Sybil died in 2014, but I realize now what a web of connections there were between all these people that I had no concept of, had friendships going back 50, 60, 70, 80 years, right? So the story of the church, Sybil, I don't think was necessarily a church-going kid, but by the 1940s, I think had become an Anglican, certainly the later 40s. And what may have spurred on her finding faith, her faith, is that once World War II started, she and Fred both joined up. Fred was quite a bit younger than her, and they both joined up to the Canadian Forces in 1943. Fred was still 18, not quite 19. And Sybil, I believe, joined up when Fred joined up because she realized she could contribute too. And, by then it was clear this wasn't going to end quickly by 1940, 42 or early 43. So they both, I don't know if Sybil joined up perhaps because she thought that maybe she could look after her little brother somehow. I don't know. But Sybil ended up joining the Royal Canadian Air Force Women's Division and mostly helping with base functions at Canadian bases, secretarial and office work and stuff, but supporting the operations of the bases. And Fred joined the Army. He ended up in a tank corps, so infantry tank corps. And by the time he was 19, likely, almost 20, when he got shipped overseas to England to prepare for what eventually became the Normandy landings in 1944. So in early 1944, I believe Fred was in England, based there with his regiment, tank regiment, and living in the south of England, preparing for whatever was to come. In early 1944, he was 20 at that point, in February of 1944. A very young man. He actually, like so many young Canadians did, young Americans, got a girlfriend over there. So it's one of the saddest parts of the story is that I met many, many years later the woman, Anne Green, who I don't know what her original name was, Anne, her family name, who had been his girlfriend in England. And she had sadly had to marry someone else later because Fred died in Normandy not long after the D-Day landings. So that was part of the thing that started connecting me to the story of Fred Conery that Sybil didn't speak about much. And so while Sybil was in the Royal Canadian Air Force Women's Division, based at bases in Canada, she did get to see Fred at least once or twice on leaves, but they were also at a base together briefly. I don't know if she visited him at the base he was at or he visited her, but I found a photograph after Sybil died, a little one that she had written on that just said the last time. So it has quite an effect on me because I've never had to, face the decision about getting called up or joining up. And I've thought of myself as a pacifist, but my main connection to that period now is the memory of Fred and Sybil, both joining up, but Fred paying the ultimate price, which is being killed in action in mid-August 1944. But 2 months after the D-Day landings, the Allies still had not reached Paris. And one of the key places that was stopping that was a town called Falaise, a few, maybe 100 kilometers from Paris, towards the Normandy coast. So the Canadians and the Polish freedom volunteers were fighting together, and some British, and the Americans were in another part of Normandy, all trying to get to Paris. And Falaise was a huge block to that. The German army in France was making its last stand there. And during August, there were some terrible battles at Falaise where many Canadians and Polish soldiers died. British soldiers too, I believe. Multiple operations to try to break it was called the Falaise Pocket. And they didn't quite have the Germans surrounded, but there were many, many, many well-armed German soldiers that were trying to prevent the Allies from getting to Paris, which would have signaled probably to everybody that the war was pretty much going to be over after that in the Allies' favor. So Fred died on August 14th, 1944. And a tragic part of the story is that it's highly likely that while he was helping guard the headquarters for the regiment behind the lines, the battle lines, the headquarters was bombed by British bombers. Bombs that fell behind the lines by accident, because everything had to be timed for where you dropped your bombs. And there was smoke that was being used to try to direct the planes as to where to drop the bombs. And the smoke drifted. So that it's possible that there was an investigation afterwards, but it seems highly likely that Fred died as a result of friendly fire, and the commander of the regiment too, and many other people who were at the headquarters behind organizing their regiment's battle. The thing about Fred Conery, I don't know much about him other than having some photos of him and the very little Sybil said, but he was hugely admired as a young fellow. He was what you'd call, I guess, strapping. I don't know whether he was tall, but very good looking. And Sybil was a very good looking girl, and Fred was a very good looking boy, very, I guess Irish, American, Canadian stock, whatever. So, and they were just remembered many, many years later by people who had met them as children on South Pender. So Fred also had taken up the guitar as a boy. So as a teenager, he would be wandering around with his guitar, going places. And there's a story I heard, in the early 2000s by an older gentleman on North Pender called Frank Trice, who was probably around 90 at the time. And he told me a story about how he and young Fred, who is much younger than him, I think in the late 30s, so when Fred was, 16, 17, maybe the early 40s before Fred went to war, were rowing between the islands for some reason, from Pender to one of the other Gulf Islands, main island or something, to do probably some work of some kind. And Fred had brought his guitar along. So that worked out really well because Frank Trice did most of the rowing, which worked out well for Fred, but also the time passed well. Because instead of having to have, men conversations, Fred played the guitar. I don't know if he sang or not. He might have, because I've seen a picture of him with a Gene Autry type hat on, like a cowboy hat on. So I think he might have done cowboy type songs, because the movies were big in the 30s, the Westerns, I guess. So that's how I see Fred as a most happy, easygoing person with his guitar. And he took his guitar with him into the army. And so there are photos of Fred with his guitar at base, I believe in Canada, or it might be in England, and another member of his corps, his tank corps, who also had a guitar. So there were two of them, two young guys. And there's also a photo of the two of them entertaining the Canadian soldiers, Allied soldiers, in Normandy, France, a few days before I think both of them were killed, guarding the headquarters, as far as I know. So it's another really sad aspect of things, that the music died, that those two people would have carried on in the world, and not to mention any descendants they might have had. So Fred's death was a huge shock to the family, obviously, and possibly made even more shocking in a way, because the postmaster on South Pender at the time in the 1940s was Claude Conery. He and Leah had been living here on the Richardson farm since 1932. So by the mid-40s, 1944, they were still here. Claude had been here long enough to be a well-established member of the community. Community wasn't very big. I think at most there were about 30 people on South Pender, and many of them in the region of the Valley and the Bedwell Harbor and then down Gowland Point Road. So they lived really at the center of the community of South Pender, most of which was at the south end of the island. So Claude Conery had inherited the job, or been designated postmaster, by Lilia Spalding, who was Herbert Spalding's mother, the original matriarch, as it were, of the settler community of South Pender. Lilia Spalding and Arthur Spalding had essentially begun the community here and were the first family on South Pender in the 1890s. So Lilia Spalding, from about 1900 or 1901, when the Bedwell dock was built, to 1942, was the postmistress, even though officially it was her husband Arthur who had been designated postmaster originally because women weren't allowed to be. But she had been doing the job, and eventually she was, recognized, I think, as the postmistress, and she did it for 40 years. Legendary, really. There was an article in the Vancouver newspapers about her, full-page article about the passing of an era sort of thing. But the torch was passed to modest Claude Conery, modest father of a modest South Pender family. So I'd heard that Claude was helped greatly again by a connection to the Spalding family, because Lilias would have vouched for him and made sort of certain that he would become postmaster. And so from 1942 to 1947, he was postmaster for the little post office that was down at the Bedwell Dock, that had been a center of community life the whole time Lilias Spalding was in. It was in charge, right? The dock, the ferry came in, the mail came in. Everybody went down to get the mail, to see what was going on the ferry. Kids would run onto the ferry to get ice cream while it was in dock, etc., and run off, So the ferry arriving 2 or 3 times a week, whatever it was, going one way or the other between Victoria and Vancouver was a huge deal. And the Conerys were in the center of the action. So I think between the school on one side of the Richardson farm, the Bedwell Dock on the other, this must have been wonderful place to grow up, right, in the 1930s. There's also a story that Claude told in one of the newspaper articles I found about the family, that from the Gulf Islands paper based on Salt Spring, where Claude was interviewed, and he related that he had, without really knowing it, ended up a school trustee for the South Pender School, because probably when he had kids there. But he said, I was off chasing a cow on the other side of the island, and when I got back, I found out I'd been voted in as school trustee. So that was the way the island worked, is that there weren't necessarily enough people to fill all the positions, and you could end up there hardly knowing how you got there. But in this case, it shows Claude's sense of humor that he was able to relate that in a more amusing way than I can. Something that would have heightened the tragedy of all of this is that as postmaster, he would have been the first person on South Pender to get literally the news that Fred had been killed. The letter from the Canadian, government would have come in, and a Pender Islander some years ago told me the story of Leah running up the road, waving the letter, running up the road from the government dock back towards the farm, waving the letter to say that Freddie had died, unable to contain the grief and needing to share it. It's a small community. So that's sort of an image for me of Fred's mother, Leah, and the fact that Fred's father would have received the actual envelope as postmaster, and then Mother Leah would have picked up the mail down at the dock, and then, understandably, unable to contain her grief, because this was her only son. She'd lost a daughter previously on North Pender, and I think a lot of her hopes for the future of the Conery name and everything else, and grandchildren and everything, would have been invested in Fred. But it left Sybil as the only child of the 3 left, the oldest of the 3. And Sybil was devastated too by the news. This was her little brother that she had grown up on South Pender with, and had those idyllic times here during the 1930s as they grew up together here. And so we're in the little church on South Pender, the Church of the Good Shepherd, where Fred Conery and then 2 other young men who had spent time on South Pender in the 1920s or 30s. 2 other men had died during World War II. One was Alan Crane, who was a few years older than Fred Conery, and then Philip Tice of the Tice family that came to South Pender in the later 1930s. So Philip came here as a teenager to help out on the Valley Farm when Lilias Spalding still owned it in her last couple of years, owning the farm in the valley. And then Philip Tice's father bought the farm from Lilias and had his whole family here, Philip being one of the 6 or 7 Tice children. So Alan Crane was killed. He was a Navy member in 1940. and then Fred Conery in mid-August 1944 in Normandy, and then about 12 days later, Philip Tice in Normandy, also a different part of Normandy. And around the day Philip Tice died, around the 26th of August 1944, so almost 80 years ago this year, it was almost around that same day that Paris was liberated by the American army and the Canadians coming from a different direction. So this was a huge part of the history of World War II that these two young Pender Islanders helped bring about, but did not survive. So with Fred Conery, his death is hugely important in terms of the loss of just the family. No more Conerys on South Pender because no children from Fred having been killed so young. And then Sybil did not have any children. My Aunt Sybil carried on as best she could in the women's division of the Royal Canadian Air Force into 1945. And then after the war ended in 1945, she was posted to London, where she helped with the resettlement of World War II Canadian brides. And the thing there is that if Fred had survived, he might have been resettling his girlfriend, Anne, to Canada. So it's just kind of an interesting thought of what didn't happen, i.e. Sybil trying to help Anne get back to Canada. So Sybil was posted in England for a while, worked at the War Brides, Canadian War Brides office in London, and got a chance to travel to France in 1946 once the reconstruction of, the areas that had been so devastated during the battles of Normandy were ongoing. I think she visited Fred's gravesite, but I'm not sure whether that's the same permanent gravesite as is there now, because the Canadians are in multiple cemeteries in Normandy. So many Canadians died at the D-Day landings, and in the about 3 months afterwards, when France was fully liberated, including obviously Paris. So that happened during June, July, and throughout August, and I think into September, there was a 3-month major series of battles, which are known as the Battle of Normandy collectively. So Sybil, I think she went to Paris in 1946, and I believe visited Fred's grave at the time. And Fred is now buried at one of the large Canadian cemeteries near Falaise that has hundreds and hundreds of Canadian war dead there. So Fred died with his guitar, as far as we know, and there were a few of his possessions sent home, the smaller ones, but don't know where the guitar ended up. So that's a symbol of what is lost. And because Sybil didn't have children of her own, there are no Conerys left anywhere around Pender Island from that family. Claude Conery had a brother called Bud, who had children on Salt Spring Island. And so many of them were girls. And so as far as I know, there's no Conerys from that branch of the family, Conery cousins, even on Salt Spring. So the name Conery is pretty much lost from Salt Spring as well as from Pender. So Claude Conery, after the war, Claude and Leah, after Fred's death and Sybil returning to Canada in the later 40s from her work in England, she left the Royal Canadian Air Force. Claude Conery moved from the property here, the Richardson farm, because it was sold at last. The sisters Richardson in England finally had made the decision of what to do. There had been 4 of them at one time. Maybe they were down to 2 of them. They were significant because they had hugely significant because they had donated the piece of land for the church in 1938, and also other money for the building of the church, and the church bell, which is right there at the back of the church, that can be used for any occasions, Remembrance Day or weddings or funerals. And the church bell is in memory of Gerald Richardson and his brother Norman, who had been out here living with them in his later years on the island. They were both bachelors, so there are no Richardsons. But so this church is a really in some ways memorializing the Richardson brothers, especially Gerald Richardson. So the Good Shepherd Church was named, just as a little sideline, at the last minute, because probably there were 5 or 6 different ideas for what it should be named. And the minister who first came to be the priest here was the Anglican minister from Main Island, who was instrumental in getting the church built also, along with Jerry Parkin and the entire South Pender community, Lilia Spalding being the treasurer of the church board, while she was a postmaster and general main lady of the island. So the first minister was Reverend Porter from Main Island, and the Anglican Church donated some money towards the building of it too, once they were convinced that the community was really gonna do it. But the church was named because a stained glass window was donated late in the process by members of the Crane family of South Pender, and it shows Jesus as the Good Shepherd, based on the biblical couple of references in the Bible. And it's a perfect name for the church because South Pender was really based on sheep farming to begin with. It was not good enough land for other farming. It was covered in trees. There wasn't a lot of flat land. The Valley Farm of the Spaldings and the Richardson Farm here by Bedwell both had important sheep aspects to them, and Gerald Richardson was basically a sheep farmer. He was the sheep farmer or shepherd of the area. So the window being a Good Shepherd window, and then the minister saying, but I mean, it seems obvious now, it has to be called a Good Shepherd. So I think of South Pender Islanders as the Good Shepherds, the ones who stay on the island and do stuff. And my Aunt Sybil and Winifred Spalding, for example, were definitely good shepherds for the island and the church in particular. Sybil, I think in the late 40s, partially as a result of the shock of losing her brother Fred, I think became devoutly Anglican. And I think the faith really kept her going to deal with how to make meaning out of this, losing her sister when she was 9 years old so awfully, and then her brother kind of far, far from her and the family. And so suddenly, I think that helped, and her closeness with Winifred Spalding throughout that period, who was like a second mum to her and was a devout Anglican, and was living full-time on the island by about 1950. Winifred and Herbert, after Herbert's long logging career here, there, and everywhere on the BC coast, came back to Pender in 1950. And around that same time, Sybil would have been visiting her mom and dad at their new place that Claude had somehow got enough savings together to buy an 80-acre property. This is a big piece of property, right, on the east side of the island, the other side of the valley from Gowland Point Road, on Plumper Sound, so facing Saturna. It's a fabulous area that was becoming newly developed after he had bought it. He had 80 acres. There was another chunk, and his piece of 80 acres and the other pieces further down towards the point got joined together eventually to become the Boundary Pass Drive subdivision in the early 60s. But by 1947, when Claude bought his 80 acres there and built his house on what is now Conery Crescent off Boundary Pass Drive, there was nobody else living over there. The closest place was the old Crane property at Camp Bay over the hill of the point. And so it was had never really been settled. I think Claude did logging over there. There had been logging done before. I think it was very close to the Spaldings' big property on the east side of the island, the valley, and then an area called Little Bay on Plumper Sound. And Sybil would have been visiting in the late 40s and early 50s while the Conerys had established themselves there on that side of the island. The road only came from there into the valley. There was no road up to North Pender because there was no bridge at the time. So the community was still based around water access at Bedwell, with ferries coming into the government dock, the mail still coming to the post office there, and somebody else was postmaster after Claude. So Claude built a nice little cottage on the Plumper Sound side of the island there. He had 80 acres and carried on. He was by then getting into his late 50s, early 60s. And Sybil would have been visiting as often as she could from her base back in Vancouver after World War II. Sybil had also become, I believe, after the events of the war and the death of Fred, a pacifist, a strong pacifist. So she was an Anglican and a pacifist, did not believe in war, and she kept that for the rest of her life. And she passed some of that on to me, the pacifist side of things. And she was also fairly progressive. So she'd have been a liberal, I would guess, and certainly was a Trudeau liberal in the 60s, and even a NDPer at times, right? So on that side of things, whereas South Pender had been quite conservative with Lilia Spalding, and some of the families here, Sybil became more liberal as an adult. So she was based in Vancouver in the 1950s. She had a single woman's career working there, and then ended up working for the main Anglican cathedral in Vancouver by the 1950s, Christchurch Cathedral, which was a major center of Vancouver life, especially for people who were church-going, because the Anglican church was strong. Through that, I think her Anglican faith was cemented. She got to know bishops and, the things who were running the church there. And she soon became the Western head of a major charity based out of England called Save the Children Fund. So she had a career at a time when not that many women had careers, but she was choosing to be single. Sybil was very good-looking, beautiful, had a great fashion sense, and so had no end of people who wanted to marry her. And once she started doing international traveling as part of Save the Children Fund's efforts to raise funds worldwide and distribute them for major relief efforts, Save the Children Fund was like Oxfam, that level of large-scale charitable work, right? Fundraising, etc. So she was vivacious and very good at public speaking and PR. So for 10 years, from 1955 to 65, she was the face of Save the Children Fund for Western Canada, but also going off to places in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa even. So she was in Athens, Vienna, I think Italy, because Italy was very impoverished after World War II, so that southern Italy, especially helping with saving the children, essentially, with the charity called Save the Children. And she went to Cyprus, Lebanon, I think Gaza, because I have some photos, and most interestingly, Uganda, because a friend of hers she made for life was a Save the Children Fund person from England who was based in Uganda at that point. And she had a great memory when she came to Sybil's memorial service after Sybil died, of Sybil arriving on a plane in Uganda, coming off the plane. And it was like, Grace Kelly arriving or something. She was so well turned out and whatever. And the friend Christine was just struck by how charismatic she was and how appropriately she would be able to raise funds for the charity with her demeanor and her presence, right? So this is the person I came to know as my aunt 15, 20 years later, when I came in 1972. So the other key thing about the 1950s is that because Claude had the big 80-acre property, he was able to give Sybil a gift, 2 acres of land across the water, basically from this sort of large, gentle indentation in the coast that's there, facing Saturna Island. And Sybil chose that piece. The property had not been subdivided, but she chose the piece there because it was across, in viewing terms, from the Connerys' place, but about a kilometer across the water, straight across water, The Connerys' place was up on a bit of a bank. Sybil's little place that she chose was on a lower bank, but you could see back and forth. And so the idea would be that Sybil, if she had a place there, could see where her folks were, and her folks could see where she was. And so it's one of the little geographical aspects of why South Pender is so special, is that the actual place and where a little point is or whatever is significant to why the person is there. So Sybil, through her friendship with Herbert and Winifred Spalding, had a person who could build a house, a log house, which was Herbert Spalding. Herbert and Winifred were living on the island by the early 50s, and as soon as Sybil got her 2-acre lot given to her by her dad and her mom, Claude and Leah, she had Herbert volunteering or offering to build a log cabin for her. And that was done in about 1954. So that log cabin is still there, the original one-room cabin. And it was added on to be a 2-room cabin because Sybil brought all her friends to visit from Vancouver at different times on the ferry to Hope Bay. They'd come down. Once the bridge was built, it was a lot easier in 1955 and on to have the bridge built. So again, timing and location are everything. And the timing was that the bridge between North and South Pender was opened in 1955. It was a road all the way connecting down. Before that, all coming to Bedwell by boat, basically. And so Sybil was able to come and visit after 1955 when conveniently, wonderfully, she had her little place. And she dubbed her little cabin and the property Little Splash, which was presumably because of the waves right there on those particular rocks. Again, those particular rocks making a little splash gave the place its name. Her mom and dad had not named their place, so I don't think they were as whimsical, but Sybil had the island thing of naming. They had a South Pender thing, which some people have, of wanting to name the place, right? So Little Splash was where I came to. Little Splash was where Sybil spent 15 years coming to visit regularly to go see her mom and dad. It's a great story from her friend Jennifer, who became her maid of honor when she did get married eventually. Jennifer remembered to me coming down several times, starting in about, I think, Easter 1957. Jen had a great memory for that. They'd come down, they'd get down there sometimes very late at night because the ferry might not come in till like 10 o'clock up at Hope Bay from Vancouver on a Friday night. Get into Hope Bay, and then Jen would have her car, I believe. The bridge was open, and they'd drive down, get to the Connery place. You could get to the Connery place by that time, decent enough road, but the road stopped there because the Boundary Pass Drive subdivision had not been built yet. So off the main road, just a little, kind of a bumpy driveway down to the Connerys' place off the main road at the east end of the valley. So Jennifer had this great memory of arriving with another friend of theirs, close friend of theirs, Jessie, and Sybil to the Connery place, and then heading out in the pitch dark to walk to Sybil's little cottage, Little Splash, which is a good kilometer along the coast. So further than it looks when you're looking across the water, because all there was a trail. And she said they'd arrive with bags full of canned goods and stuff for camping for a weekend or a week or a long weekend. And then Sybil would head off in the dark, hardly needing a flashlight on this trail. And then Jen and Jessie would have to traipse along behind her, carrying the bags of stuff they'd brought, right, to get there in the pitch dark with their lights, whatever they had. Did they have flashlights? Probably rudimentary ones, at 11 o'clock or midnight. And then the next morning, when they headed back along the trail to the Connery place to check in and see how things were and then go elsewhere on the island, they'd find all the bits of the groceries that had fallen out of the bags during the night, the cans of soup and such. So it just gives an idea of, in the late 1950s, that area being fairly undeveloped and really still trails, between one or two houses that were over on that side of the island. Anyway, by the early 1960s, the Boundary Pass Drive subdivision came into being because Claude and Leah Connery sold their property in 1959, and then other pieces of property down the road were added to it. And a Salt Spring developer developed it in the Boundary Pass Drive subdivision. off of which is Conery Crescent, a little road. And at one point, basically the only little house on Conery Crescent was Claude and Leah Conery's house that they had built and then left behind. So that takes us to, I guess, the early 1960s, and Sybil working away in Vancouver, coming for weekends. And in this period, she had met my relative, my Uncle Bill Wilson. And he was my mother's older brother, so highly respected. And my mother had an older sister, but then an even older brother. And he was a naval officer, and married naval officer who had been very young, a commander of a ship during World War II, because he was in the Navy before the war started. And when they needed fill-in commander of a ship, I think he was 24 when he commanded a ship on the North Atlantic run, the convoy, the Atlantic convoy going across from Halifax. Battle of the North Atlantic was what that whole time frame was called, where ships would escort other Navy ships, Canadian Navy ships would escort merchant ships across to England with troops, etc. And they had to be escorted because there were all the U-boats, the German U-boats out there trying to sink anything coming by. So my Uncle Bill was a very young officer in the 1940s. He was very good looking, tall and slim. He married during the war, had 4 children by the later 50s. And at some point that marriage, he presumably wasn't happy with it, because he met Sybil while she was doing fundraising for the Save the Children Fund. The Canadian Navy was significantly involved in helping the Save the Children Fund and other charities raise money for various purposes of development and aiding people in foreign aid, I guess. And so he would have been a commander of a ship in, I think, Esquimalt when Sybil came, and they fell in love. So Sybil, having had all these suitors before then, various ones, one had a ranch, one of the suitors had a ranch in the Caribou. So I'm glad she didn't choose him, because I don't think that I would never have met her. So I'm glad she fell for Bill, my uncle, and whatever complications there were, because he was married and had 4 children, they eventually got married in 1969 here in the Church of the Good Shepherd. And it was the 4th wedding that had been here, only the 4th wedding that had been here since 1938 when it opened. So there hadn't been a lot of people getting married here. The first 3 all happened between 1938 and 1945. One of which, I think the third one was Philip Teese's older brother, John. Philip Teese was one of the Teese boys, and he was the one killed in World War II shortly after Freddie was. His older brother, John, was a World War II war hero of the Italian campaign, and he survived, came back, and got married here in 1945. But so that's 24 years, I think, between weddings here. So by 1969, Sybil had waited a long time to marry the man she loved, because he had a very complicated divorce to figure out. But thank God for me that she did marry him and hung with it, because that's how I came into her life, and vice versa through my uncle's connection. And Sybil was a significant part of any time she was here, helping with anything to do with preparing the church for services, etc. Bill came often to visit on the island with her. You know, she had her place at Little Splash. And I think Bill would generally stay with the neighbor often. And that by then was Mary Roddick, Mary Crane Roddick, who was an old friend of Sybil's from when she was young. So the wedding in May of 1969 was really kind of an event of the year almost, except that later that year, one of the Spalding boys got married. David Spalding's younger brother, John, got married. So all of a sudden there were 2 weddings after 24 years with seemingly, I think it was 24 years, with no weddings, right? 2 big ones, because Sybil had connections everywhere. There were people coming from all over the place via Vancouver, people sending telexes from I don't know, Greece, Vienna, I don't know, but she had all these connections from her work. And so really eclectic, right? Whereas John Spalding's wedding later that year was very island-y and Spalding related, right? So this was all sorts of different people. So Sybil's wedding day itself, May, I believe it was 4th, 1969, was quite an event. And so there's a little story that her maid of honor, Jennifer, told me, who had visited Pender many times to come and stay with Sybil. She was a friend from, the 1950s. So Jen was scheduled to be Sybil's maid of honor. That's an old friend. I think Jen had bought a piece of property here by then, too. This is what Sybil did. She had friends. She brought them here, and some of them would decide they're coming back to stay. So Jen's one of the best examples. Another one from the 1950s is Marjorie Bailey, who was a teacher at one of the schools in Vancouver where Sybil was working before her career as with Save the Children Fund. So Jennifer Axtons, who then became Jennifer Barlow, and Marjorie Bailey were two, certainly Marjorie the most significant South Pender Islanders later, who came to South Pender because of Sybil. She had a fabulous ability to make friends with people and just draw them in, right? So attract them into her, her life and then keep them for many, many, many years. So Jennifer told me the story about the wedding day, that it's amazing it ever happened, because before even the wedding day, the minister who was supposed to marry Bill and Sybil had died earlier, a few months earlier. And he was the priest of Pender Island at the time, the rector, Bishop Michael Coleman. And he had become friends with Sybil. He was a retired bishop who was retired on North Pender and was serving as the minister for the Anglican churches. So he died suddenly in February of 1969. And this was very saddening because he was going to marry Bill and Sybil. And he had also had to work out the issue of Bill being a divorcee when they were going to get married, because in the Anglican Church, divorce was still considered fairly problematic in terms of getting remarried, like by an Anglican minister. So he had apparently worked this out, how he was going to be okay with it. There's a hilarious letter that you can hardly read because his handwriting was so bad, explaining the logic of how it would be okay. Sybil was terribly relieved, but then he died suddenly in his late 60s, so unexpectedly. And there's a plaque on the wall dedicated to him because this altar rail here is in his memory, built by Herbert Spalding from a cedar tree, I think, on Herbert's property. So Bishop Coleman was very important. It was a big blow, but Sybil was happy to get married in May. But on the day itself, Herbert Spalding, who was to be Bill's best man, was quite ill with the flu. So he wasn't going to be able to be best man. So they had to haul in the neighbor, a friend, Vern Roddick, Mary Roddick's husband, and Mary, the old friend of Sybil. So Vern Roddick steps in to be best man when it's clear that Herbert's not going to get here. So Bill was on South Pender. The Conery family, the Connerys, Leah and Claude, had, after leaving South Pender, gone to North Pender and had been living there for 10 years, uneventfully and basically in retirement, right? Because they were in their, 70s by then. So they were living on North Pender. Sybil had got worked through all the issues. Marriage was going to happen, wedding was going to happen on this lovely Saturday in early May 1969. And the best man is ill. So that first part was covered. Then they heard that there had been a truck that had dumped all of its wood at the ferry terminal at Tawasin, right on the ramp as it was coming onto the ferry. So all the people who were coming that morning were going to be delayed. So the Connerys had heard this. Jen was up there with Sybil at the Connery place. Bill was down here on South Pender in Little Splash. They weren't allowed to be together before they got married, right? Officially. So there's a delay going to happen because of this. And then Bill phoned up to ask where Sybil had put the marriage license, right? And she said, I thought I'd given it to you. It must still be in Vancouver, in my apartment in Vancouver. So Bill had been tearing Little Splash apart, looking for the marriage license, Sybil's little place there. and it wasn't there. So officially not really supposed to be happening without the marriage license. You're supposed to provide that to priest. Priest was a substitute priest because Bishop Coleman died. The priest came from Saturna because there wasn't a full-time replacement on South Pender yet. And he sounds like a James Bond-like hero figure because his name was Reverend Dangerfield, Reverend John Dangerfield. So Reverend Dangerfield and his wife arrive at the dock from Saturna. The ferry's delayed because of all the wood on the dock at Tsawwassen. Sybil and her maid of honor are sitting in the living room having nice cups of tea up there on North Pender, right above the road where the ferry traffic would be coming by, because it was right near Browning Harbor that the Conerys lived for the 10 years after they left South Pender, till 1969, when the year Sybil got married. So they're having a nice, kind of relaxing time. They've decided somehow they'll have to just explain to the minister about the marriage certificate, but don't worry, we'll give that to you. Like, it'll be okay. So I think that had been settled, and they were waiting for a while because they were expecting the ferry to be late, when all of a sudden piles of cars start flying by on the road right down below the house, heading south to South Pender. So suddenly Jennifer and Sybil go, oh my goodness, that's all the wedding guests. The ferry had got itself cleaned up on the Tsawwassen end. Ferries were now running to Otter Bay by then. The BC ferry service was well established. And the bride and bride's father and maid of honor were not there in front of them. So Sybil jumps in Claude Connery's car. They race off, right? Claude driving his old car down the island. Jennifer driving her car with Sybil's mum, Leah. They get to the church. Claude has already started racing Sybil into the church without waiting for the maid of honor to be inside or Sybil's mother. Like they're heading in from the road. And then it turned out Winifred Spalding was not here at the church. So everybody's pretty much arrived, but basically Sybil's just about most important guest, other than her own family, is not here because her husband Herbert is sick and cannot drive her here, and nobody has made an alternate arrangement. So somebody races off, I think Vern Roddick, the substitute best man, to get Winifred, because the wedding cannot start till Winifred gets here, clearly, right? It all worked out. The minister was fine. The wedding certificate arrived, marriage certificate arrived eventually, and all went well. And there's beautiful pictures. And within a year or so, they had expanded the little place at Little Splash to be a house, and Bill and Sybil came to live there with Bill's son, Jim, who was finishing high school and could not live with his mom at that point, right? He was the one who was still in school. So Sybil had some practice for a year or two getting Jim finished with high school as a foster son, as it were, a stepson, I guess, through her marriage to Bill. And then a year or so later, I come into the picture. In the early 70s, with Sybil and Bill Wilson, established in their little house now, a 2-bedroom house, still called Little Splash, with the original log cabin and the second room as part of the house, with the close friendship with Winifred and Herbert Spalding as a major anchor for Sybil, as well as all her other friendship. And Bill needed to find some work. He had retired from the Navy in the 1960s, had bounced around trying to do contract work. And he ended up, understandably, joining BC Ferries. And he worked his way up. Even though he'd been a commander in the Navy, you had to requalify for all your modern, basically merchant service on the water. The ferries required that. So he had to work his way up over several years through being a mate and a first mate to becoming a ferry captain, doing all the courses required, etc. And as it turned out, luckily, the only place you could be based on a ferry, working on a ferry, living on Pender, the only way you could do that is if you actually had a place somewhere else as well. And so Bill ended up as the captain of the Bowen Queen on Salt Spring Island, servicing the Fulford Swartz Bay run, the regular kind of commuter run across from Fulford Harbor at that end of Salt Spring, closest to Swartz Bay. So Bill qualified to become captain around the time that I was getting close to finishing high school. So I got to split my time between family on Salt Spring that I would board with during the week, as I had done for the years that I went to school there, coming back to Little Splash on many weekends, but also being with Bill and Sybil on Salt Spring at their place there because of the way the shift worked for BC Ferries. 10 days work, 5 days off. So I got a really good upbringing of 2 different islands and Victoria as the main city to go to. And I finished high school. I kept my grades up, which was very important to show Uncle Bill that I was going to be okay, because he worried about me being dependent on him. Sybil never worried about my future or whatever. All she did was look after the present and make sure everything was okay that way. And so it was a nice balance for me to see that my uncle, who worried a lot about whether this would be okay and I'd do okay, and Sybil going, whatever you want to do, it's okay, you know. So she gave me a lot of freedom to just be me, and as opposed to meet some expectations. But I think it generally helped that I got good grades and I was involved in sports and everything, that, you know, that I seemed to be normal and not too affected by my previous unsettled family life with Bill's sister, who was my mom, Helen. So Sybil and Bill had a really good life together from 1969 till 2006 when they left South Pender. Bill worked on the ferries. They traveled a bit. They collected artwork, West Coast artwork. They filled up the house at Little Splash with art of all kinds. They had artists come to visit to bring stuff. There was a gallery on Salt Spring, that art gallery that Sybil got to know the owner of really well. He was a neighbor to the Salt Spring cottage where they stayed when Bill was working there. And they collected all sorts of art. So I grew up with art around me, and, you know, the beauty of that, as well as the beauty of the setting with Saturna Island right across the water and Mount Baker out the dining room window, and, you know, really spoiled for beauty of location and, upbringing. So I realized a little bit of that idyllic South Pender life much later than Sybil and Fred had it in the 30s growing up, but I had it to some extent in the 70s. I was pretty much the only kid on South Pender at the time, but I had my friends on Salt Spring and my school life there, so a lot of freedom when I was back here. Bill retired in 1984 at 65 years old, and they were based full-time on South Pender. And I think that was a really happy time because their health was still good in their 60s and 70s, and their fitness was good, and Sybil had learned to cook really healthily and everything. So they made it through the 80s and into the 90s really, really strongly. And in early 1991, I brought somebody I had met in Victoria when I went back to university there. I had gone off and tried some things, like to try to be an engineer at one time, mechanical engineer, didn't like that. Went back to university, met my partner Susan, who I brought immediately to South Pender. She fell in love with the place immediately. It didn't hurt that I brought her to the little church here the first day we were on the island, and had already proposed that this was where we could get married whenever she wanted to. So basically, that was a few weeks earlier, and on the steps of the Church of the Good Shepherd, Susan said yes. And I said, yes, what? Yes, we're going to get married here. It helped that a little deer wandered out, it's like the Garden of Eden. And so the church, hugely important, even though I'm not devoutly Anglican, I attended services here, hugely important place, because it was part of what cemented Susan saying, yeah, I'll do it. And she liked Bill and Sybil. They got along really well. So in 1992, May of 1992, 23 years, not quite to the day, but the same month after Sybil and Bill had been married here, Susan and I got married here. And Sybil and Bill were thrilled because they were like my parents at the wedding, and they hosted, people they hadn't seen in a long time, family and stuff who came. So we had the place totally full both times, just chock-a-block, people hanging around outside. At one point, the fire marshal said that you could not put more than 48 people in here, and you have to really work to get 48 in, but I think that was just to not make it too ridiculous. But I think at Sybil's wedding, there might have been people outside we had to cut back how many people we could invite because they had to be into coming on the adventure to Pender Island and the drive all the way down. So Sybil and Bill essentially were my parents for pretty much all my adolescence and my most of my adult life. And I treated Little Splash as home, and Sybil was really pleased that I did that. And by the early 2000s, their health was deteriorating a bit. Bill lost his driver's license from age-related issues in a car accident. Sybil gave up hers voluntarily. Sybil had learned to drive specifically to be able to pick me up at the ferry or the water taxi when I came home from school. And that's perhaps one of the great memories I have of Sybil she didn't know how to drive. And then one day I arrived at Hope Bay on the water taxi on Friday afternoon after school. Water taxi brought me back from Ganges to spend the weekend. And the car is there and Sybil is there. And I didn't know how that had happened. Sybil had got her driver's license over a few weeks or whatever, driving on the island, because she didn't like driving anywhere else, but you could actually take a test, maybe on Salt Spring, or maybe the inspector came over here, you could do a test. In any case, she got her license, possibly on Salt Spring, and drove me home. And that was like just amazing. And that was so great because that was about 1973, just after I'd started at school on Salt Spring in grade 8, end of grade 8. But it also meant that she could, a couple of years later, drive her dad on a trip when her mom Leah died. Claude, I think, expressed an interest, but Sybil may have suggested it, that she could take him back to where he had been as a young man in Virginia, northeast U.S., when he'd gone back from Salt Spring after all the Conery family tragedy on Salt Spring in around 1910, 1912. And so he had strong memories of being there when he was young. So Sybil flew to Virginia with her dad and then drove him around for 5 or 6 days, having just got her driver's license to drive on Pender. And so it suggested some of the courage and just do things even if, it's not second nature to you, right? So getting married was a big adjustment for her learning all the cooking and raising a couple of boys in their teenage years, or not raising, helping keep them going, and then getting her driver's license and driving her dad. And so that was in the late 70s. Claude Conery moved back to Pender, North Pender, because Sybil was based on Pender. And so he lived on North Pender where he had been throughout the 1920s, and very close to Hope Bay, where they had been, in the 1920s and when the kids first started going to school just up the hill. So I knew Claude Conery during the late 70s primarily. I was a teenager finishing high school, and Claude Conery was the closest thing I had to a grandfather, because I never knew any of my other grandparents. So although I'm not a Conery, I feel like that's sort of part of me through Sybil, and then knowing her dad, and, more recently learning more of the story of the entire family. A very modest family that had 115 years on the Gulf Islands, starting in 1892 when Claude's born on Salt Spring. And Sybil left the island in 2006 to go to Victoria because Bill, her husband, decided they needed to move there. In their age. Sybil didn't want to leave, but she came back in 2014 after she died because we brought her ashes back. And we had a service here in the Church of the Good Shepherd in August 2014. And her ashes are in the memorial garden behind the church. And some of her ashes are in the North Pender Cemetery in the same plot where Claudia's body was put in 1930. January 1930. So we've got North Pender, South Pender covered for Sybil, and we know about the Salt Spring. I know a lot about the Salt Spring connection, partially because I went to school there and had to learn a lot of that. So it's a story of 3 islands and a very modest family, really 5 people in all. There are no Conerys left who are named Conery, but I do my thing to try to keep the memory alive. And I'll just finish with the memorial garden at the Church of the Good Shepherd. That's a big part of the story. There was no memorial garden at the little church here for the first 40 plus years of its existence. So from 1938 to 1982, if you wanted to be buried or ashes put in the ground, it would have to be at North Pender Cemetery, the island cemetery on North Pender, where Claudia's buried, and many North Pender Islanders and a few South Pender Islanders. Their ashes or their bodies. So Sybil had lost her mum, Leah, in 1974, and I think had her ashes in her closet at home at Little Splash. Then her dad died in 1982, August 1982, almost 90 years old, had a great life. He died on Salt Spring, where he was born, at the care home there beside the hospital. And Sybil was able to spend lots of time with him because she was based on Salt Spring so much of the time as a ferry captain's spouse, right? So it just beautiful connections like that let things work out. So Claude died in 1982, and suddenly Sybil had two sets of ashes, Leah's and Claude's, and no place that she thought was right to put them. So she spoke to her friend Marjorie Bailey, the old friend she'd brought once to visit the island, who ended up moving to a lot nearby on Boundary Pass Drive. And as had her maid of honor, Jennifer, who in the 70s, 80s, 90s were fixtures on that side of the island with their, at least, friends and families. Marjorie was a single woman all her life, but a real dynamo. She helped start the Pender Library that's now so good and well established. She also helped get the Pender Post started, the Pender Post. So it's a real dynamic person. And this is in her late 60s, early 70s, single Marjorie, teacher, a wonderful woman. Marjorie lived to 101, and she's in the memorial garden. So is Winifred Spalding's ashes, so is Herbert Spalding's, tons of Spalding, and all sorts of other South Pender Islanders, whether they were devout Anglican churchgoers or not. It was meant to be a community church. That's a community memorial garden that's, blessed as part of the church grounds. So Sybil had two sets of ashes in 1982, and there was Marjorie Bailey, important Anglican in the church here, who was in charge of any projects that needed to be done. And so Marjorie Bailey said, we will start a memorial garden. So that happened very quickly. It's a very modest garden. There were two sets of ashes, but other people had ashes. There are ashes that predate Sybil's dad. So there are stones in the memorial garden that there's always someone looking after it who's associated with the church, so that if a new stone is needed, and what people do is put plaques on the stones with the people's names. And there are ashes generally, not always ashes there, but generally, quite often there are ashes somewhere in the ground nearby. And the ashes become part of the soil. So the memorial garden began in 1982. As a result, very modestly, it's now got a beautiful sign and a little fence behind it, some plants that the deer won't eat because the property has no water and the fences do not keep anything out. So the memorial garden is to the whole island, but key to Sybil's family's story, because she and Bill Wilson, ashes were put there in 2014 after, 30 plus years earlier. Claude's ashes were put there when it was first built, and Leah's ashes, and Marjorie Bailey's there, the Henshaws, the Penders, Winifred and Herbert Spalding. So I think that covers pretty much the whole story. The ending really is that Sybil and Bill died in 2014, and I was left kind of to carry on the memory of the Conery family. The Wilson family has other people, my cousins, Bill's children, and I have a half-brother from my mom. And so, we can carry on the Wilson family, but there are no more Conerys on South Pender. But if you want to come and see and feel their memory, you can go to Connery Crescent off of Boundary Pass Drive. And if you go to the steps going down to the beach access there, and you look behind you instead of heading down the steps, that's the Conery house there. From 1947, 46, 47, after Freddie died, that was the way, the family, that was where the family was based. Sybil and her mom and dad. And if you look across from the steps going down to Connery Crescent, on the end of the point there, directly across, about 1 kilometer away, you can see there's still a little house there. It's a little abandoned because it was bought by someone who hasn't taken care of it, but that's Little Splash. So, and you can come to the church, see the remains of the Conerys in the garden and all their friends and things. And inside the church, there's a roll of honor on the wall, which shows that Freddie Conery came from here and was killed in action, and that Sybil Conery served in World War II also, and all the other people they knew, like Herbert Spalding, etc., who are memorialized here. So the church is, a central part of the family story, and that's why I chose to ask to do the discussion of their story here. I'm kind of choosing today, February 26th, 2024, to provide the story of the Conery family of South Pender, because it's a day past 100 years since Fred Conery was born. So Fred Conery was born February 25th, 1924, and he was the youngest child of 3 of the Conery family. He was born while the family lived on North Pender, and he was born at the hospital on Salt Spring Island, and then came back immediately to North Pender and spent his entire life of 20 years, tragically short, as a Pender Islander, and very particularly a South Pender Islander, who I think hoped to return to South Pender Island and continue the family story here, and wasn't able to. So luckily, Sybil Conery, his older sister, kept the story going and has passed it on to me one way or another, when I'm hoping to keep the story going of the Conery family of South Pender Island.
Thank you very much to Frank for doing this interview. This interview and the entire series has been made possible with funding from the Capital Regional District, the Pender Island Community Resource Center, the W SÁNEĆ Leadership Council, W SÁNEĆ School Board, the Pender Islands Museum, and the South Pender Historical Society. Thank you to all these organizations for contributing to make these recordings possible.